There is a particular kind of love story that Hollywood has never quite known how to sell. It does not end with a wedding. It does not end with a sunset. It does not even end with two people living under the same roof. It simply does not end. And because it refuses the neat conclusion, the world rarely knows what to do with it. It sits outside every category we use to explain how relationships work, and so we mostly look away from it, uncomfortable with something we cannot label. Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman have been confusing people for more than 50 years. They met in 1971. They lived together for 11 years before marrying. They built a production company, raised 3 children, and made some of the most memorable films and television of their generation. They separated twice. They never divorced. They still talk every single day. They still share the same restaurant table. At 81, Danny DeVito has done something he spent most of his career avoiding. He has said it plainly, without theater, without performance, in the way a man speaks when he is simply reporting the truth. She is the only love of his life. Not one of the great loves. Not the most important relationship. The only one. And the story of how he arrived at that sentence, through a childhood that was genuinely difficult, through a career the industry fought against at every turn, through a marriage that changed shape without ever breaking, is worth understanding from the beginning, because the beginning is where everything that followed was already decided. Daniel Michael DeVito Jr. was born on November 17, 1944, in Neptune, New Jersey, the 4th child of Daniel DeVito Sr. and Julia DeVito. He grew up in Asbury Park, a small city on the Jersey Shore that was working class in the plainest sense of the word. People worked, money was tight, and there was not much room for anything that looked like pretension. His father ran a small business, a billiard hall and candy shop, and by most accounts was well liked by the people who knew him. But the home life was more complicated. His father drank. The drinking changed him. Danny, from a young age, learned to read the temperature of a room before he walked all the way into it, a skill that would serve him later in life in ways he couldn't have anticipated, but one that no child should have to develop. By multiple accounts, the household was volatile enough that local police were called more than a dozen times during the years Danny was growing up. He did not talk about this publicly for decades. He didn't need to. You can hear the childhood in the performances, in the way he plays men who carry something compressed and pressurized just beneath the surface. His mother, Julia, was 40 years old when Danny arrived, already exhausted from raising older children, and she never pretended otherwise. She told him, at some point during his childhood, that she had not wanted another baby. She was proud of him, she said. But she hadn't wanted him. Danny DeVito has spoken about this in interviews with a kind of detached honesty that suggests he processed it long ago, or at least learned to carry it without letting it become the whole story. He did not become bitter. He did not become sentimental about it. He became someone who was very, very good at surviving rooms that were not designed with him in mind. There was something else that Danny carried from childhood that almost nobody outside his immediate circle knew about for most of his public life. He was born with a condition called multiple epiphyseal dysplasia, sometimes called Fairbanks disease, a rare genetic disorder affecting bone and cartilage development. The condition is why he stopped growing at 4 feet 10 inches, but the height was almost a secondary concern. Fairbanks disease attacks the joints, the hips, the knees, the spine. It creates chronic pain that tends to worsen over time, and by Danny's own account in later years, he spent most of his adult life managing daily pain that routinely registered at a 6 or 7 out of 10. He went to film sets in that pain. He did physical comedy in that condition. He shot scenes over and over again, sometimes dozens of takes, without telling directors or producers why he sometimes moved the way he moved. Hollywood told him not to discuss it. The industry's judgment was that pain was weakness, and weakness did not sell tickets. He listened, at least for a while. But here is what he did not do. He did not stop working, and he did not stop believing that the work was worth doing. By the time Danny DeVito arrived in New York City in the late 1960s, he had trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and had accumulated exactly the kind of resume that would make a conventional talent agent nervous. Mostly theater, mostly small roles, no real credits that translated to mainstream bankability. He was not tall. He was not conventionally handsome in the way that the studio system understood that phrase. He was not easy to categorize. He took an apartment on the Lower East Side that he shared for a period with another struggling young actor named Michael Douglas, who was quietly keeping a significant piece of personal information out of most conversations. His father was Kirk Douglas, one of the most recognizable stars in American cinema. The two young men were equals in the struggle, even if they would not remain so for long. They ate cheaply. They walked their own headshots across the city and handed them to anyone who would take one. Douglas began to book roles. DeVito kept getting rejected. The rejections were not mild. He was told, in various ways, that the industry did not know what to do with him. One production company, by his own account, offered him a substantial sum of money, a figure that in today's equivalent would approach $1 million, on the condition that he agreed to undergo surgery to alter his face. The suggestion, as Danny understood it, was that his features were too irregular, too distinctive, too far from whatever the 1960s casting departments considered a marketable face. He declined. According to DeVito, he burned the contract. He has told the story in several different interviews across the decades, and the detail that stays consistent is not the money or the surgery. It is the burning. It was not a decision. It was a declaration. He once told a casting director who pushed him to change, "I would rather be a first-rate version of myself than a second-rate version of someone else." He was in his mid-20s. He had no money, no credits, and no particular reason, from the outside, for confidence. But the conviction was absolute. Whatever Danny DeVito was going to become, he was going to become it as himself. During stretches of the late 1960s, he lived out of his Volkswagen Beetle and used the shower facilities at a local YMCA. He did not talk about this for a long time, not because he was ashamed of it exactly, but because he did not think it was the most interesting part of the story. He parked cars for income. He once worked as a florist's assistant. For a period, he stood in the window of a clothing store, dressed in a suit, perfectly still, pretending to be a mannequin so that pedestrians outside would look twice. He was, from the beginning, someone who understood that the job was to make people look. On a cold night in January 1971, a 23-year-old woman from the Bensonhurst neighborhood of Brooklyn walked into a small off-Broadway theater in Manhattan. Her name was Rhea Perlman, and she had come because a friend of hers was in the cast. That was the entire reason. There was no larger plan. She bought a ticket, found a seat, and waited for the show to begin. Rhea Perlman had grown up as the daughter of Philip Perlman, a Polish immigrant who had built a modest business in the toy industry, and Pearl Perlman, who managed the household with the kind of quiet efficiency that working-class homes require. Bensonhurst in the 1950s and 60s was a particular world. Tight-knit, ethnic, heavily Italian and Jewish, a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone's business and had opinions about it. Rhea was sharp and funny in the way that certain people are funny. Not as a performance, but as a survival mechanism, a way of connecting, a way of being understood. She had studied drama at Hunter College, graduated in 1968, and had spent the years since then doing exactly what Danny DeVito was doing on the other side of the city. Showing up, auditioning, getting rejected, showing up again. She was working as a waitress at the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center, which was a prestigious address for waitressing, if not for acting. She sat down in that small theater, and then she saw the man on the stage. He was compact, broad-shouldered, not particularly tall. He was not what you would describe as a conventional leading man. But he was doing something on that stage that Rhea Perlman would spend years trying to describe in interviews and never quite getting it right, because what he was doing was not easily translated into language. He was commanding. He had a gravitational field around him that seemed to pull the audience's attention in his direction regardless of where the other actors were standing. He was funny in a way that came from somewhere real rather than somewhere practiced. He was, in a word she has used in multiple interviews, riveting. When the show ended, Rhea did not wait for someone to introduce them. She asked around until she found out his name and whether he was single. Learning that he was, she walked up to him and, as she has described it many times over the decades with obvious pleasure in the memory, came on to him big time. They went to dinner. They talked for what felt like the rest of the night. Danny DeVito would say later that he knew within 20 minutes of that conversation that Rhea Perlman was the woman he was going to spend his life with. Not a possibility. Not a hope. A certainty. He did not explain the mechanics of that certainty, and perhaps there are none. Perhaps it is the kind of knowledge that arrives without an explanation and asks only to be honored. 2 weeks later, Rhea moved into his apartment. 2 weeks. Not 2 months. Not after a careful, deliberate courtship with appropriate intervals between dates. 2 weeks. Because both of them seemed to understand that the deliberate approach was being deployed in service of a caution that neither of them actually felt. They had found something that felt true, and they moved toward it. For the next several years, they built their lives the way young actors build their lives. With almost no money, a great deal of stubbornness, and the specific kind of mutual support that comes from two people who understand exactly what the other person is trying to do because they are trying to do the same thing. In 1975, the connection Danny had maintained with Michael Douglas, now becoming a serious force in Hollywood as both an actor and a producer, led to the breakthrough that would change the trajectory of Danny's career. Douglas was producing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the adaptation of Ken Kesey's novel, to be directed by the Czech filmmaker Milos Forman. He wanted Danny for the role of Martini, one of the psychiatric patients. The studio resisted. They wanted a more recognizable name for every role, and Danny DeVito was not yet a recognizable name in the way that studios mean that phrase. Douglas held firm. Danny was cast. He appeared in the finished film for slightly under 6 minutes. He left a mark that critics and filmgoers were still discussing decades later. The film won 5 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Director, Best Actor, Best Actress, and Best Adapted Screenplay, a sweep that remains one of the most complete in Oscar history. Danny was not nominated, but he was, at last, on the map. People knew the name. They knew the face. And crucially, they understood that whatever that face was doing on screen, it was doing something distinctive and real that you could not look away from. Then in 1978, he made a decision that everyone around him told him was professional self-destruction. He turned down multiple film offers, studio roles that would have brought him the mainstream visibility that a career like his most needed, to audition for a television sitcom. The show was called Taxi. His own agent told him not to do it. Television in 1978 was still considered, in certain Hollywood circles, a step backward for a film actor, a medium you retreated to when the film work dried up, not one you chose over it. Danny had read the script. He knew. The character was Louis De Palma, a cab dispatcher, the kind of man who sits in a wire cage above the floor of the garage and uses the elevation as a metaphor for the contempt he feels for the people below him. Louis was mean, petty, self-serving, occasionally delusional, and consistently, spectacularly awful in all directions. He was also, in Danny's hands, completely and darkly human, which is the thing that made him funny rather than merely unpleasant. Danny walked into the audition and delivered a long monologue that, by the accounts of people who were in the room, left everyone silent afterward in the particular way that means something real just happened. ABC was hesitant. Danny was not tall enough, not conventional enough, not the shape of a television star. James L. Brooks, one of the show's creators, threatened to walk off the production if they did not cast Danny DeVito. They cast Danny DeVito. He signed his contract without negotiating, accepting a rate approximately 40% below what his co-stars were being paid, because he understood something that did not require a financial advisor to explain. He needed this role more than he needed the negotiating position. He was right about the role. Taxi ran for 5 seasons, won numerous Emmy and Golden Globe Awards, and made Danny DeVito a household name. In the second season, Rhea Perlman joined the cast. She played Zena Sherman, a recurring character who was, among other things, Louis De Palma's girlfriend. The producers were reportedly surprised by how naturally the chemistry between them played on screen. They did not know, or perhaps had not fully registered, that Danny and Rhea had by that point been living together for several years and knew each other in the way that two people know each other when they have been through the lean years together and survived. In January of 1982, after 11 years of living together, Danny DeVito and Rhea Perlman got married. The ceremony was quiet, without spectacle. Neither of them has ever described it as anything other than a formalization of something that had already been true for a very long time. They did not need a wedding to understand what they had. But they had a wedding because at some point the paper matters too, even to people who are above caring about the paper. That same year, Rhea began playing Carla Tortelli on Cheers, the sharp, physical, relentlessly funny barmaid at a Boston bar who would become one of the most beloved characters in American television history. She played Carla for 11 seasons. She won 4 Primetime Emmy Awards for the role. She was, by any measure, one of the best comic actresses working in American television across the entire decade of the 1980s. Danny talked about Rhea's success in interviews the way a man talks about something he is prouder of than anything he has done himself. In 1983, while Danny was still filming Taxi and Rhea was beginning work on Cheers, they started a production company together. They called it Jersey Films. Over the next 2 decades, working nights and weekends, and in the margins of careers that were already consuming, Jersey Films became something that most production companies never become, a genuinely consequential force in independent American cinema. The list of films it produced reads like a survey of the most interesting American movies of the late 1980s and 1990s. Pulp Fiction, Erin Brockovich, Out of Sight, Garden State, Man on the Moon, Get Shorty, among others. These were not safe projects. They were not the kind of films that studios greenlight without hesitation. Several of them were projects that had been turned down elsewhere before Danny and his producing partners decided to keep them alive. The Pulp Fiction story is perhaps the most famous example of how Jersey Films operated. Quentin Tarantino had written a script. The major studios had passed. Jersey Films kept the project alive, provided Tarantino's production with money and office space, and let him make the film on a budget of approximately $8 million. Tarantino told his producers that it would look like a $25 million movie. He was not wrong. Pulp Fiction went to Cannes and won the Palme d'Or. It transformed American cinema's understanding of what narrative structure could do and what genre films could be. And it was possible, in no small part, because 2 actors from New Jersey and Brooklyn who had built their company in the margins of their primary careers decided it was worth making. Their 3 children were born during this period: Lucy Chet DeVito in 1983, Grace Van DeVito in 1985, and Jacob Daniel DeVito in 1987. All 3 grew up on film sets, in the orbit of a creative life that their parents had built together. All 3 would eventually find their own ways into the entertainment industry, which perhaps suggests something about what a childhood in that environment does to you. It does not make the life look glamorous so much as it makes it look possible, and like something worth doing. In 1996, Danny DeVito directed Matilda, based on the Roald Dahl novel, and he did what very few directors do when they have the chance. He made it a family affair in the most literal sense. He played the brutish, contemptible Mr. Wormwood himself. He cast Rhea as the equally awful Mrs. Wormwood. Their own children appeared in small roles throughout the film. It was, in every practical sense, a Danny and Rhea production made visible on screen, the creative partnership and the domestic partnership occupying the same frame.